Friends and viewers, good day. In last one of my previous discussion, I had told you about Charles Dickens, about Oliver Twist, and today another one of his great novel, The Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. So this is a novel, a very popular novel, well known among people, among the literary peoples. So, as you know, Charles Dickens is a very famous man. He had written scores of novels like Pickwick Paper, David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, Christmas Carol, Hard Times. These are the novels of the great novels written by Charles Dickens. So today let us discuss about one of his another great novel, The Great Expectation. Charles Dickens was born, as I've told you before, in 1812 at Landport near Portsmouth. And he died in 1870. And so he had written scores of novels, as I told you. Today we are going to discuss about this piece of literature, The Great Expectation. So what is it about? Great Expectation is the story of Pip's childhood, an orphan boy, Pip. He went often his painful experience to adulthood as he moved from Kent marshes to busy commercial London, encountering a variety of extraordinary character ranging from Abel Magwitch, the escaped convict, to Miss Havisham, locked up with her unhappy past and living with her ward, the arrogant, beautiful Estella. So the novels start like this, that my father's name being Prip and my Christian name Philip. My infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip and called to be called Pip. So this is the story of a young orphan boy, Pip. He used to live with his sister and her husband in the marshes of Kent. Sits in a cemetery one evening looking at his parent tombstone. Suddenly an escaped convict springs up from behind a tombstone from the grave, grabs Pip and ordered him to bring him food and file for his leg iron, the escaped convict. Pip obeys, but the fearsome convict is soon captured anyway. The convict protects Pip by claiming to have stolen the items himself. One day, Pip is taken by his uncle Pumblechook to play at Sattie's house, the home of wealthy dowager Miss Havisham, who is extremely eccentric. She wears an old wedding dress, an extraordinary character, Miss Havisham. Always used to wear old wedding dress everywhere she goes and keeps all the clocks in her house stopped at the same time. During his visit, he meets a beautiful young girl named Estella, who treats him coldly and contemptuously. Nevertheless, he falls in love with her and dreams of becoming a wealthy gentleman, so that he might be worthy of her. He even hopes that Miss Havisham intends to make him a gentleman and marry him to Estella. But his hopes are dashed when, after months of regular visit to Sattie's house, Miss Havisham decides to help him become a common laborer on his family business. What happened next? With Miss Havisham's guidance, Pip is apprenticed to his brother-in-law Joe, who is the village blacksmith. Pip works in the forge unhappily, struggling to better his education with the help of the plain, kind Biddy and encountering Joe's malicious day laborer, Orlick. One night after an altercation with Orlick, Pip's sister, known as Mrs. Joe, is viciously attacked and become a mute invalid. From her signal, Pip suspects that Orlick was responsible for the attack. One day a lawyer named Jaggers appears with the strange news. A secret benefactor has given Pip a large fortune. Pip must come to London immediately to begin his education as a gentleman. Pip happily assumes that his previous hopes have come true, that Miss Havisham is a secret benefactor and that the old woman intends for him to marry Estella. Pip assumes that his secret benefactor was Miss Havisham. In London, Pip befriends a young gentleman named Herbert Pocket and Jaggers' law clerk, Wemmick. He expresses disdain for his former friend and loved ones, especially Joe. But he continues to pine after Estella. He furthers his education by studying with the tutor Matthew Pocket, Herbert's father. Herbert himself helps Pip learn how to act like a gentleman. When Pip turns 21 and begins to receive an income from his fortune, he will secretly help Herbert buy his way into the business he has chosen for himself. But for now, Herbert and Pip lead a very undisciplined life in London, enjoying themselves and running up debts. Orlick reappears in Pip's life, employed as Miss Havisham's porter, but is promptly fired by Jaggers after Pip reveals Orlick's unsavory past. Mrs. Joe dies and Pip goes home for the funeral, feeling tremendous grief and remorse for his sister. Several years go by until one night a familiar figure bursts into Pip's room, the convict Magwitch, who stuns Pip by announcing that he, not Miss Havisham, is the source of Pip's fortune. He tells Pip that he is so moved by Pip's boyhood kindness that he dedicated his life to making Pip a gentleman. And he made a fortune in Australia for that very purpose. Abel Magwitch, the escaped convict, which Pip helped during his childhood, now he became his real benefactor. Pip is appalled, but he feels morally bound to help Magwitch escape London. As the convict is pursued both by police and by Compeyson, his former partner in crime, a complicated mystery begins to fall into place when Pip discovered that Compeyson was the man who abandoned Miss Havisham at the altar and that Estella is Magwitch's daughter. Miss Havisham is raised her to break men's heart as revenge for the pain her own broken heart caused her. Pip was merely a boy for the young Estella to practice on. Miss Havisham told Estella how to break the man's heart because she was himself a broken woman. Miss Havisham delighted in Estella's ability to toy with his affection. As the week passes, Pip sees the good in Magwitch and begins to care for him deeply. Before Magwitch's escape attempt, Estella marries an upper-class lout named Bentley Drummle. Pip makes a visit to Sattie's house, where Miss Havisham begs his forgiveness for the way she has treated him in the past, and he forgives her. Later that day, when she bends over the fireplace, her clothing catches fire and she goes up in flames. She survives but becomes an invalid. In her funeral days, she will continue to repent for her misdeed and to plead for Pip's forgiveness. The time comes for Pip and his friend to spirit Magwitch away from London. Just before the escape attempt, Pip is called to a shadowy meeting in the marshes, where he encounters the vengeful evil Orlick. Orlick is on the verge of killing Pip when Herbert arrives with a group of friends and saves Pip's life. Pip and her hurry back to effect Magwitch's escape. They try to sneak Magwitch down on the river on the rowboat when they are discovered by the police, who Compeyson tipped off. Magwitch and Compeyson fight in the river and Compeyson is drowned. Magwitch is sentenced to death and Pip loses his fortune. Magwitch feels that his sentence is God's forgiveness and dies at peace. Pip falls ill. Joe comes to London to care for him, and they are reconciled. Joe gives him the news from home. Orlick, after robbing Pumblechook, is now in jail. Miss Havisham has died and left most of her fortune to the pockets. Biddy has taught Joe how to read and write. After Joe leaves, Pip decides to rush home after him and marry Biddy. But when he arrives there, he discovers that she and Joe have already married. Pip decides to go abroad with Herbert to work in the mercantile trade. Returning many years later, he encounters Stella in the ruined garden at Sattie's house. Drummel, her husband, treated her badly, but he is now dead. Pip finds that Stella's coldness and cruelty have been replaced by a sad kindness, and the two leaves the garden hand in hand. Pip believing that they will never part again. So this is the end of this story, the Great Expectation. Now let's move towards the characters involved in this novel. So, as all of you know, that the Pip is the main character, the hero, the protagonist of this novel, the narrator of A Great Expectation. Pip begins the story as a young orphan boy being raised by sister and brother in the marsh country of Kent in the southeast of England. Pip is passionate, romantic, and somewhat unrealistic at heart, and he tends to expect more for himself than is reasonable. Pip also has a powerful conscience, and he deeply wants to improve himself both morally and socially. Another character is Stella, Miss Havisham's beautiful young ward. Stella is Pip's unattainable dream throughout the novel. He loves her passionately, but though she sometimes seems to consider him a friend, she is usually cold, cruel, and uninterested in him. As they grow up together, she repeatedly warns him that she has no heart. Miss Havisham, a very interesting figure, a very interesting character, is a wealthy, eccentric, old woman who lives in a miner called Sattie's house near Phipps's village. She is a maniac, often seems insane, flitting around her house in a faded wedding dress, keeping a decaying feast on her table, surrounding herself with clock stops her clock was stopped at 20 minutes to 9. As a young woman, Miss Havisham was jilted by her fiancé minutes before her wedding, and now she has a vendetta against all men. She deliberately raises Stella to be the tool of her revenge, training her beautiful ward to break man's heart. Abel Magwitch, another character, the benefactor of Pip, Abel Magwitch, the criminal Magwitch, escaped from prison at the beginning of Great Expectations and terrorized Pip in cemetery. Pip's kindness, however, makes a deep impression on him, and he subsequently devotes himself to making a fortune and using it to elevate Pip into a higher social class. He becomes Pip's secret benefactor behind the scene. So, another Joe Gregory, the very kind-hearted man, the husband of his sister, Mrs. Joe, Pip brother-in-law, the village blacksmith. Joe stays with his overbearing, abusive wife, known as Mrs. Joe. Solely out of love for Pip's Joe quick goodness make him one of a few completely sympathetic characters. Another Mr. Jaggers, powerful, foreboding lawyer. Another character, Herbert Pocket. Pip first met Herbert Pocket in Garden of Satis house when, as a pale young gentleman, Herbert challenged him to fight. Years later, they meet again in London. Herbert becomes Pip's best friend. Wemmick, Jagger's clerk and Pip's friend. Biddy, a simple, kind-hearted country girl. Biddy for Dolgy Orlick, Mrs. Joe, Pip's sister, Uncle Pumblechook, Pip's pompous, arrogant uncle, Compeyson, a criminal and former partner of Magwitch, Bentley Drummel, Molly, Mr. Whoopsell, Startube, Mrs. Skiffins. These are the characters, ladies and gentlemen, involved in this great novel, The Great Expectation by Charles Dickens. I hope when you will read it, you will find it very interesting. Thank you very much for your kind consideration.